From the very early days of web development, we've been able to define reusable blocks of code as functions in JavaScript. Functions can be defined in many ways. Traditionally, you'll see a line like this to define a function. It's the most common way that new web coders define their functions. After a while, they may change their pattern to use something like this. These two lines do the same thing. They both create an internal variable that contains the code for the function. It's a subtle difference, but the second definition makes it clear that a variable called myFunction will contain the code. For those of you that are more experienced, you're probably already yelling at the screen about the global scope. Please bear with me and don't dismiss me just yet. For those that don't know what the others are yelling about, let me offer an explanation. When you define a function or a value of any type in this manner, it is placed in the global scope and is available to any script running in the browser window. Variables placed in the global scope are attached to the topmost object within the DOM, the window. Globally defined values are available to any script running from within any section of the current page, including third-party libraries that have been loaded. This may seem like a great idea, but there is a very real risk that any one of those libraries could also have a function with the same name that would overwrite and replace your original code. If you define a global variable with the same name as something defined in a library that also uses the global scope, the last script loaded will be the one that defines the final value. This can make debugging very challenging. For those of you that were yelling at me, here's the minimum way the function should be defined. Notice the use of the var keyword. That tells JavaScript to limit the scope of the function to the current containing code block, usually the script tag within an HTML page. In this case, the function won't be available to any other libraries. Now, if a library has its own myFunction code block, it won't interfere with your code. Or more likely, your code won't interfere with a library. If we want to include our function in a single object within our page, we could use this pattern. We're just creating an object to hold our function. A JavaScript object is just a construct which can contain as many variables as we wish to store. Functions can be defined within objects too. This makes for nice encapsulation of related code and promotes reusability. We could easily extract this object to a central library or copy the code to a new page if that made sense for our needs. Generally though, copy and pasting functions is a bad idea. It's much cleaner to create a library of functions and make references to a single set of code from all the pages that need it. Note the use of the var keyword. This object is still only available in the containing code block. It will not be available globally. An even better idea is to create a single global object with a name that is uniquely your own and attach any values or functions to that object. The global object you create is referred to as a namespace. Using this pattern allows you to define as many functions and variables as you wish without fear of having name conflicts with other libraries. Placing your namespace in the global scope allows other libraries or even dynamically loaded content to have access to your creation. This is the pattern you would use if you want to make a library of functions. In this example, a better choice for the name is obviously required. My object isn't really unique or descriptive. You should pick something that is meaningful to you, is short, and has little chance of being in widespread use throughout your organization or intended user base. If you're not using namespaces in your JavaScript code, I strongly encourage you to start doing so right away. I'll be using this pattern in the samples within this video. Now, var, namespace, scope. If you're not familiar and comfortable with these concepts, perhaps a code example will help. For those of you who are comfortable, hang in there with me a little bit longer. I'll be using Notepad++ as my editor and Firefox as my browser. These are just a personal preference and are not required to follow along with this video. You may substitute any editor and browser of your choice. Since I mentioned function scope, here's a page that defines 4 functions just as my previous slide listed. I skipped the first pattern because I don't wish to give it any more attention than to say, don't define your functions that way. This page contains the bare minimum needed to demonstrate a few functions. I include jQuery, define a couple of divs, and jump right into the script tag. All my functions are wrapped up in the document ready function that is called by jQuery when the page finishes loading. I'm using the shorthand syntax for that. If you're not really familiar with what I'm talking about, it's not required at this point, but I strongly encourage you to study up on jQuery. Pluralsight has numerous videos on the topic. Notice how I use jQuery to reference the two div tags that I defined on the page. I save a reference to each div outside of the function definitions. This eliminates the need for each function to go searching for the div and gain a reference every time it executes. For this sample, the performance difference is almost non-existent, but the code is cleaner and easier to read. Each function just appends a text item to div1 to show that it executed. Function 1 is defined without a var keyword. That makes it available on the global scope. Function 2 is defined with the var keyword. That makes it available only within this document ready function. Function 3 is defined within an object that is also only available within the document ready function. And function 4 is defined within an object that is available on the global scope. The global object name GOBJ isn't really well defined. It does nothing to identify itself and isn't very unique. For the purposes of this demonstration though, it will have to do. Please don't repeat this pattern in your real code. Make sure anything you place on the global scope has a unique, short, meaningful name. After the functions have been defined, we can call each one. Notice how function 3 and function 4 are called. They are prefaced with the name of the object they are contained within. I append a blank line to the output, then use jQuery to load another HTML page into div2. jQuery is smart enough to execute any code that exists in the document ready function for that page too. Let's take a look at what we're loading in the second page. There's just a single HTML paragraph tag and a bunch of if statements in our script. Notice how we make use of jQuery even though we don't include it. This page will only work when it is loaded with Ajax. That's exactly what the load function from the other page does. It uses Ajax to load the contents of this page into the second div on the calling page. In this script, I'm doing the same thing 4 times. So let's look at the first if statement. I verify that function 1 is defined and call it. If the function can't be found, I append a message to that effect to the current body. jQuery is clever enough to make sure this ultimately gets displayed in the calling page. I do the same checks for functions 2 through 4. I'll switch back to the main page and bring it up in Firefox. Here's the result. Notice that functions 1 through 4 all execute first from the first page. Then functions 1 and 4 execute from the second page. As expected, function 2 and function 3 were not found by the second page. They're not contained in the global scope. If you're not clear on what's going on here, you might want to create these pages in your own environment and tinker with them. Using a tool like Firebug can really help you follow along with where the functions reside in memory. For now, I'll move along.